learn something. If I hope nowhere such conflicts will happen, but I'll be very quick. So there were clashes between ethnic Uzbeks and ethnic Kyrgyz in southern Kyrgyzstan in 2010. Nearly 420 people died and 80,000 people displaced. So this is a very short presentation of how our organization, CAFME, and Kyrgyz Libertarians responded to this crisis. So first of all, we've set up a peace room at CAFME's office. Over 50 volunteers. They coordinated all the humanitarian efforts and peace building efforts in Kyrgyzstan. The second, it was an information campaign because this is much stronger than the bullet. So we did a lot of TV and radio products, stickers, T-shirts, handwritten letters from kids, from children, asking to stop the war. Uzbeks and Kyrgyz, they all appeared in our programs. And you see a picture of us also making these T-shirts in 3 languages that we wanted to stop. And there were very different activities within this framework. But I just want to be very brave. And even 10 years ago, fake news was a big problem, especially during intra-ethnic conflicts. This creates hatred and hate campaigns. So we used a big database of volunteers in the field, in the conflict zones, and if there was any information that something is happening over there, we would call them, fact check, and then inform the public through different means, including the social media and TV. And the fourth, these are our volunteers and our members of CAFME team also. So we did targeted humanitarian aid and mobilized hundreds of volunteers that we crowdsourced and crowdfunded, and sent the humanitarian aid through airplanes and cars to the southern part of the country. So this is just a brief information of what happened and what we did. And of course, this were 24 hours a day, 7 days a week efforts, without any sleep. And just some lessons from that part. I think this also prepared us to be ready to respond if any such issues arise in terms of the current crisis. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mitru, for that. It was a remarkably successful campaign, and to pivot very quickly to be able to deal with rumors and the spread of hatred. Well, we've seen now hatred emerging, prejudice against Chinese people because of the bad behavior of the Chinese Communist Party and the Chinese government, which I think should be universally condemned in this context. But people have gone to blaming ethnic Chinese people as if they somehow were responsible for it. The problems of persecution and denial of equal citizenship to Muslim people in India, which is an ongoing issue, and also just Asian appearing people outside of Asia that are being targeted in some cases for being blamed for this virus. I think I'd like to start off with the question, is this responding to this within the normal sphere of the free market think tank movement? We usually deal with issues of economic policy in the margin, about taxes, about property rights, and so on. For our 3 panelists, do you think that this is an issue that we should also be addressing, these additional social questions that can be so harmful?
As I was the first speaker, maybe I could shortly respond. Of course, even if we are think tanks that only develop policies, it is the high time when our issues and our principles might be questioned, because other opponents, they just say, oh, look, your free market doesn't work, the government should be strong, the government should control everybody, the government should stop it. and of course a lot of expectations from the government, while in fact the markets do all these elements in the events back 10 years ago and even now. For example, in Kyrgyzstan, in the first days of this pandemic, we didn't have face masks. And a very interesting case, by the way, we ordered face masks from this woman. She started a company to produce face masks 10 years ago, but she couldn't get permission from the government. And only now, when we had this pandemic, the government said whether she could resume her production, and she immediately did it within just few days. And she is the life savior for Kyrgyzstan now. When we sent humanitarian relief to doctors in different districts of Kyrgyzstan, we also ordered from her. The Ministry of Health orders from her the face masks. So this is one of the examples when actually the market solves. And if our think tanks do not showcase such cases, and also if our think tanks and if our movement is not involved in humanitarian aid, in informing what is going on, in debates, in public debates over the efficiency of the measures that the government is undertaking, then yes, it will be hard for us to act in the future. That's why we are acting now.
What's your take on this, Bhakti and Ali? What role do you think the think tanks you're involved in can and should play in promoting social harmony and peace?
So if I can step in here, I mean, as the partners of Atlas Network, I think most of us have historically prioritized the issues on the economic freedom and economic liberties over other issues. And that has been a strategic choice, I think, for most of us. But increasingly, it seems to me that only the emphasis on the economic freedom without an increasing emphasis on the political freedom and religious freedom may not offer us a holistic framework. So to go back to your question, I would like to argue that this is a time for us to also rethink on how we frame our issues. Of course, there are risks of dilution of the agenda. But for instance, you mentioned the work which I have been involved on the platform of Islam and Liberty Network. And on that network, what we have been doing is that what is the message of Islam when it comes to economic freedom, political freedom, and religious freedom. Indeed, all three are interlinked, and we can see sooner or later, if all freedoms are not respected in some ways, we will lose the other. So I think that is kind of rethinking, which is at least we are doing, and we have, to some extent, have built some intellectual foundations for that work. But it's a long journey. I think it's a journey which also entails risks, because when it comes to religion, then one can also raise the question whether the religious argument is the most conducive argument or not. So that's controversial also. But at least in the context of Muslim societies, I think that this would be helpful in moving towards a culture of more equal rights and mutual tolerance.
Bhakti, India has been very much in the news because of the concern about the citizenship law and questions about equal status for all Indian citizens. So what have you been doing? What are your thoughts on that? And do you see this pandemic as making that problem worse or dampening it?
So Tom, I think you're absolutely right that India has made it to international news and for all the wrong reasons in the recent months, right? every time there is a discussion about extremism in India, and this is extremely unfortunate that I think we rarely end up going beyond our understandings of Islamic fundamentalism or at times left-wing extremism. But I think what we've been witness to in India in the recent past is a marked rise of Hindu right-wing extremism. And what is troubling is how much the Indian collective psyche in some way has come to just really embrace this brand of Hindutva, which is an extremely militaristic, aggressive notion of Hindu nationalism. Having said that, I don't think this is something that is new to India. We have seen the ugly face of Hindu terrorism rise up time and again throughout history in the subcontinent, starting with probably the partition in the subcontinent to the assassination of Gandhi, who fell to right-wing extremists at that point, to several instances in the post-colonial context. Having said that, I think as a liberal organization and as personally for me, what has been the most troubling is the level of normalcy that the violence has come to acquire in recent times. I think in India, we've increasingly become a society where violence is the new normal. And I think it is this mundaneness and everydayness of the violence that is confronting all of us. When I think about the role of CCS or other liberal organizations in Asia and the region, I think now is the time, and I'm building on what Ali spoke about, I think now is the time for all of us to really amplify our efforts to nurture an ethical and rational imagination amongst this generation, because what we are witnessing is an entire generation that is being brought up on extremely fundamentalist and extremist ideologies in the region. And I think now is the time for us to really engage with these fault lines that we are all living with, not only through the lens of political economy, but more importantly through an ethical, existential, and moral lens in some way.
Can I make that more concrete in the following sense and ask Ali and Ms. Ojan also to share thoughts? How do you convey that to young people or through social media or on radio or television? You describe something as an alternative, how we should be trying to create an ethical culture of mutual respect and toleration and freedom. What would you do to do that, to have an impact, in particularly in such large societies as India or Pakistan or Indonesia or elsewhere?
Yeah, if I may, I think I'll give you an example of the work which in Malaysia, on the platform of ideas, we have been recently involved. And just to give you a very quick context, Malaysia is a multi-ethnic society, 60% Malay Muslims, and 25% Chinese, and then the Indians, the local indigenous Indians. So, but there has been interracial tensions, although luckily Malaysia has escaped from most of its history any violent exchange of that tension, except one brief episode in 1969. But what has happened over years that the policies of discrimination on the basis of races have become a part of normal public policy, both by the government and also by the private sector. Ideas recently started a project to talk about equality on the basis of going beyond racial discrimination. I think the uniqueness in Malaysian case is that here actually a majority feels under the threat, not the minority. So the way we are addressing it by addressing the concerns of the majority population, because they feel that if, let's say, Malaysia were to ratify this international treaty called ICERD, International Convention on Elimination of Racial Discrimination, then they might lose some privileges, which over years through quotas and special rights the Constitution has provided. So we are talking to them and especially to those organizations which represent this Malay nationalism that actually we are not taking these rights away, but this is actually ultimately will be a better future for generation to come. And I think by addressing these concerns, by directly engaging with the groups which are vocal, we hope to cover some mile, and we hope to improve the perceptions about these issues.
Tom, you didn't turn on your mic.
There we go. Sorry. Back to Mitru then. As a marketing question, as I recall, you made a point of having radio ads with people speaking the different languages or speaking with clear accents, so you could tell, oh, this one is Uzbek, or this one is Kyrgyz, or what have you. And then having the T-shirts with 3 languages, Uzbek, Kyrgyz, and Russian, that we want to live in peace together. What are the techniques that you would recommend for reaching out and humanizing the other, if you will, seeing them not as enemies or as a scary mass, but seeing them as other human beings? It might be more difficult for people to target them and persecute them when we see each other as humans. What's your marketing advice as an expert in that area?
Yeah, maybe I'm not fully right, but anyways, there will be people who will be against what you are doing. For example, the T-shirts that we did in 3 languages, we had some problems because, for example, one ethnicity, they were very against of putting the language of another ethnicity in that T-shirt. But that was in the beginning, right? That was in the beginning. The first reaction was different. But later on, when they were convinced that it's better to live in peace rather than keeping this anxiety and attacking those who try to make this as one group, not separate groups, then they will understand. But such groups, they will understand later. But I think they will understand earlier or later. Even with this pandemic, for example, the first cases that we got in our country were from the people who went to Umrah to Saudi Arabia and to Dawat to Pakistan. So when they came back, although our country is the majority of people are Muslim, there were attacks on those people who went to this Islamic sites outside the country. But in the beginning, the reactions that we did and our friends did, that it could come from anywhere. It could come from any country and from any ethnicity. And scapegoating those people is not right. So I think such messages they reached after some time. And currently, we luckily do not have any such scapegoating currently. So I think from the marketing perspective, it is, of course, we should understand that we cannot convince 100 people in the beginning, but we should not fear from understanding that there will be some people, especially the aggressive people, who will be against it. But still, as our principles and values are that we are all humans, and no matter the color or ethnicity or race, we should always keep in mind that part, because anyways, the people will understand later.
Let's hope so. We're seeing this also happening or being used as an excuse to seal borders as well. So it's one thing to say if you have a lot of infected people on one side and not on the other, I can see a rational argument for limiting travel under those circumstances. But this is not the case between Germany and Poland, for example. It's not the case between Mexico and the United States, but these have been used by politicians to say no more travel across these borders. And Certainly in some of these contexts, these have also ethnic or racial or religious overtones. What do you see as the future? How are we going to unwind this after the pandemic, when hopes declines, to restore freedom of trade and freedom of travel without fearing, oh, those people are Spanish speakers or Muslims or Hindus or Chinese or who knows what? How are we going to undo this? Any thoughts?
Maybe.
Michu?
Okay, I was expecting maybe Ali or Basti would start. Um, yeah, indeed. Even in China, for example, there were some people, foreigners, in Wuhan, who stayed during the crisis. But after they reached some level, and they said, now we got rid of the virus, of this pandemic. Now there's a hatred against the foreigners who actually stayed there. Some of them are Kyrgyz too, who also look Chinese like me. So yes, this is a hard question. And another thing is not only the borders between countries are closed, but the borders between regions and districts and villages are closed in Kyrgyzstan. So currently, for example, I'm in the capital city. So the capital city has two borders. I live in the central part, and the central part is also closed. And it's very hard for the freedom of movement. But I think what we could do in order to restore freer trade and freedom of movement is to start it now, to start offering solutions where we could liberalize already, and how this is going to happen, because we cannot live under such circumstances for a long time, but still we need to tackle the pandemic so that it couldn't rise. So at least starting from promoting the freer trade already, and then that will just lead us for freedom of movement between countries, for tourism in the future, because I think trade already connects different ethnicities, different religions, and different borders. So maybe this is the time when we could focus on trade, so that these people were, after some time, after months or so, they could be the faces of freedom. They could say, "Hey guys, we traded with these countries. We saved you from hunger because we brought you bread, we brought you meat." So I think currently we need to support and focus on the trade issues. That's my opinion. But of course, it's not that this is the top priority. Everything is a priority.
We have another panel going on also on trade that Bhuvana is leading, because that's a very important element also. Last thoughts from Bhakti and Ali, and then we'll open it to conversation with the wider group.
Yeah, I think response to this question is that one of the damages which the pandemic and the government response to it has done is sort of hijacking or control of a narrative. We don't hear alternative views as much as we would normally like. And the fear which has been provoked on the due to the spread of the virus and has led to lockdowns, and has led to a situation where I think we are losing the plurality or variety of information, is to me a major challenge, which as think tanks we should all be focusing on. So what are the alternative interpretations? Is, for instance, this Imperial College study, which has been used in the governments all over the world, is that the final truth? Who is challenging this dominant view about the prescriptions, the policy prescription? So I think that is a challenge which we, as think tanks need to address. We need to demand more transparency from our governments and offer alternative views as much as possible. And that sort of alternative interpretation and views can hopefully bring out new and innovative solutions, which are possibly not in sight today.
Bhakti, and then we'll go to general conversation.
Thank you, Tom. Just a last thought. I think it is really time in times like these that all of us are confronted with our essential sameness. And by essential sameness, I mean some sense of a radical equality by virtue of just our precarious humanness. And in that sense, I think a pandemic like this is unique and an opportunity because it really shows us that there is a possibility of dissolving the notion of an other, and it is this notion of an other that in some sense has been an anvil of extremism around the world. Having said that, I think what we've witnessed in India is also a very ugly reminder of how even a calamity like a pandemic can be communalized. And when we begin to understand this, I think as liberal organizations, it's primarily a reminder for us of the journey that liberalism needs to traverse in the region and the work that remains to be done by all of us. And I think now is the time more than ever for us to strengthen our movement for freedom in the region. And when I say freedom, it is also looking at a conviction and a lesson that some of the rich traditions of liberalism in the subcontinent have taught us, right? Which is the simple fact that freedom for the self is absolutely meaningless without the freedom for the other.
That we have a question here from Rod that is quite a deep one. What are some of the clever ways governments are cloaking statist or authoritarian policies that you've seen and that we need to be aware of? Because of course, quite often we have long-term statist policies introduced under some temporary measure or guise. What has come across your radar screen in this regard?
Well, I can share the experience in Malaysia. I think one of the observations which we had is kind of a dominance of the narrative by the Ministry of Health officials. So we hear only, let's say, what the Director General of the Ministry of Health is saying every day. It seems that the information, the statistics, and even the political debate about it has been curtailed. And that is maybe also because of the particular political background in last few months where the government was changed within the parliament by a change of a major political crisis. But then that has given further opportunity to I would say, to bureaucrats to control the information. And that is concerning. And I think unless we open up the debate at a political level and we let that influence the policy, that may continue.
Any other example? I could mention what's happening in the United States right now with massive subsidies that are not merely to keep businesses afloat. These are being directed towards favored industries and groups. And they barely even bother to hide it at the moment. They just say, we needed to stop the harm from the pandemic. And even at the level now of unemployment insurance compensation has raised people above what they were earning before. That's going to make it very hard to restart businesses when people are receiving more money to be unemployed than to be employed. This is one example of long-term consequences. Any other examples there that that you've seen, possibly in India, Bhakti?
So I think there is what most of us have been worried about in specifically given the COVID situation is the radical expansion in the scope of government intervention across domains in the country. And the public support that this intervention has garnered, primarily because it has been articulated in the language of healthcare and national security. There have been several ways in which we do feel that the burden of regulations has just gone up manyfold on people in India, primarily marginal and small entrepreneurs. Simple things like access to markets have been much more heavily regulated than what they were earlier, because the way in which India responded to the pandemic was by announcing a complete lockdown, which meant that borders between districts, borders between states were closed. there was an immediate turn to sort of define activities and goods as either essential and non-essential. Anything that became non-essential did not have an access to markets, and resulting in a breakdown of supply chains. At the same time, what we've seen is a doling out of several relief measures at the same time. And the worry is, like you mentioned before, we are worried whether this stands to become the new normal. Another example I'd like to add is many instances where the government has now taken over private hospitals or even private hotels and the hospitality sectors in some aspects to convert them into COVID relief centers. And this trend, I think, has been extremely worrying.
You think it might persist after the crisis is over? There's attenuation of normal rights and so
Yep.
on. Yes.
Yep.
I think it's a very serious risk. I'd like to ask if others would like to pose questions. I know that it's such a ethnically complex region throughout Asia, and who might be persecuted would vary from place to place.
Looks like Lyle has a question for Bhakti.
Okay.
Why do you think violence is being normalized, and is it a general lack of value for human life, increased tribalism, etc.? And also, if you have a question, feel free to turn your video and mic on as well and ask the speakers directly.
So Lyle, in response to your questions, I think it's difficult to pinpoint what has been happening, but there are definitely several things that have happened, especially in the last decade, right? One is we now have a government which has in some sense endorsed and legitimized the kind of Hindu right-wing extremism that we've talked about. What that basically means is that in the Indian psyche now, right-wing extremism no longer seems as an extremist ideology, but something that makes them more citizens than others. And what we are seeing is a conflation of notions of patriotism with Hindu nationalism. In cases where the government has now implemented the Citizenship Amendment Act, we do see a direct breach of the Constitution or even the legal machinery to support this ideology. I think the normalization of violence or terrorism in that sense is also because I feel that because in India we have a situation now where it is the majority that is the perpetrator, and when that form of terrorism comes from the majority, it is no longer viewed as terrorism anymore.
Let me ask a question that has been posed to us here. In this time of social distancing, one unintended consequence is likely to be we're not interacting with other people unlike us. If we're with our families or in our more closed communities, and then of course it accentuates social media, which tends to be among people who already share common views. Is this likely to accelerate this separation into different communities that see each other as being not sharing common citizenship or common humanity? Are there ways that we can overcome that?
I think I would like to offer a different interpretation of the phenomena. I would slightly disagree that the current situation, COVID-19 lockdown and self-isolation, have deteriorated the situation about the social in terms of the echo chambers. I think that was already happening even before the lockdown forced us to spend more time on our screens. But maybe the situation has escalated that. I don't think so that COVID-19 has drastically changed the trend, but it might have sped up. At the same time, it has also maybe created thinking as a part of the society, thinking in terms of the family. My personal experience is that it has allowed actually more time to get closer to the unit of the society, that is the family within us. And that is not a negative outcome at all.
I've heard that from a number of people, spending more time with their kids and not being so distracted by other things you have to do and spending more time on family life. Are there any other thoughts on what we might be anticipating coming down the road? Because it's an unfortunate natural element to reach out and blame someone for a calamity, earthquakes, viruses, whatever. Someone is responsible. Are there any thoughts on how we can foster a rational conversation that the virus isn't the moral agent? And we shouldn't be angry at other ethnic groups or religious groups because we're subject to a viral infection.
Yeah. If I were to answer this, but in also bringing in this question which Casey has posed on the group chat about how do we navigate the group think, asking the questions. What I feel like running think tanks, I feel that we need to be more courageous about our views. And also we need to definitely increase our capacity to do some analysis, which perhaps, we cannot be as resourceful, of course, as a government agency can be, but we can be creative about it, and we can be more resourceful and be more articulative about our views at this point in time. So I think that probably courage and increasing of capacity of analysis and communication can actually help in improving the communication.
Let me make a suggestion then following up on that, and that is to promote fellow feeling also. I'd like to invite more people to turn on your videos so that we can see each other, that we are here together, that we're not just names on a screen. So say hi to each other and wave and know that we are all supporting liberty together. That feels so much better to me than to see only a screen full of black boxes with names on them. So thank you very much. But I also see Philippa there, and I'd like to know if you have some thoughts on what's happening in Indonesia. Is this being accelerating ethnic conflicts, or is it not so bad as I read in the South China Morning Post?
Sure. Thanks, Tom. Hi, everyone. Thanks a lot for the discussion. I find it very fascinating, and it's really comforting in a sense to hear how other countries are also experiencing the same thing, and also to hear a lot of your work that you're doing in your respective countries. And that I think to share the experience in Indonesia, there is certain tension in that you feel with the unemployment rates going up and with people losing their jobs, there's certain tension that crisis might be coming at any time. We're not certain with what's happening, especially as now we're approaching Ramadan and people are starting to fast, starting tomorrow. But now the government has just put a ban on going homes. There's like this huge tradition that Indonesians from the urban city is going home during the holidays, and that's been banned. So we're also not sure how the public reception will be. But in terms of ethnic conflict, we've also seen a lot of really positive sentiments and positive stories out of the pandemic. So in the beginning of the pandemic, the biggest donation that came into the health services in Indonesia was actually from a minority group, the Buddhist group in Indonesia, which, as you probably know, is a very, very, very tiny minority, and mostly are from ethnic Chinese background. And they've just raised trillions of rupiahs and donated that to the health services in Indonesia. And I think that act of kindness just sparked the realization that no matter what ethnicity you are, we're in this together. And I think that kind of starts to paint a more positive sentiment throughout as Indonesia is managing the pandemic. So just to share just a tiny more positive story out of this.
Okay, so that's something that has been done that has helped to dampen down and make everyone understand that we're part of the same community.
Exactly.
the sort of thing that we could be seeing more of. We have another question that's been posed. It's a rather long one that's in the chat box, that perhaps these will not strengthen authoritarian regimes, but move to undercut them. And of course, the current worldwide discussion of the bad behavior of the Chinese government in suppressing news and stopping doctors from talking about it, and so on, has focused attention there. So it's not all bad news. There may be people waking up and saying, we don't want to go in that direction. I hope that I posed that correctly to Nuratin Kalkan, who posed the question. Well, we're running out of time here. We're at the end, and so that I would like to call very quickly on Ron Manners. Ron, are you there?
Yes. Can you hear me, Tom?
We can. We'd love to see you too.
You can, but it says the host has turned the camera off. So the host better turn me back on. Stop
I got
my
you.
video.
I got you. There you go, man.
All right.
Okay, all's well. Now, fellas, somebody raised, they thought that how wonderful it is staying home with your family. But after about 3 weeks of this lockdown in Australia, I tell you, the growth industry in about another month will be the divorce court laws. So if you want to get into family law court, into the legal profession to manage a few divorces, I think you'll see a spike.
All right.
The average Australian husband is not used to being home, and it's not working. But I'll just tell you a couple of things. The other one is that our various governments, we've got a federal government and a state government. Our various governments acted fairly quickly on the close down. It was like turning a switch off, and it turned the whole economy off. Now, after about 3 weeks of this, they are now having discussions about turning it on slowly and gradually. Now, we are at Mancal, we're doing a little bit of work putting together some economic programs to suggest that they don't do that, because if they do the very slowly thing, the students, the young people we deal with, just won't have jobs when they come out of university at the end of this year. There will be no jobs available. So we are proposing a quick restart. Just give us freedom to start and allow us all to be very sensible about how we restart. We will not start with the same sort of gregarious hugging and handshaking. We'll step back, but we'll get on with the business. That's the important thing.
Ron, I'm going to have to let you have the last word, because my colleagues say we need to end at 12:15 so we can be ready for the next one. May I ask a favor of you? Would you be willing to share the documents on that, and we could share them more widely?
Sure, we will do that. We'll put it through. It'll take another week.
Okay, well, we really look forward to it, because those kinds of concrete plans about how to sensibly resume economic activity, the discussion that I heard on the radio today, we may face real famine in parts of the world because of these breaking of supply chains and the collapse of production. It's a very serious matter. So this is a really positive contribution.
Thank you. Thanks.
So we're going to catch up, Ron, and send that. We will share it with everyone. We're going to start again at 12:30 for our next pair of concurrent breakout sessions. You have the links, and James has put them in the chat box. And again, you can continue the conversation on the Discord community as well. See you shortly in the next session. Thanks, everyone. Thank you, Bhakti, Ali, and Michu. Bye-bye.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you, Tom. Bye-bye.
Thank you.